to other fantasy-based MMOs in the space, which turns out to be a lot of people, but again, I'm just trying to be conservative with the claims here. Some things about the game that make it similar to others of the same ilk. It's a fantasy-based system, so if you're familiar with Tolkien or Lord of the Rings, or you've seen screenshots of World of Warcraft, it's pretty similar. You make a character, and the game's never really over, which is why they call it EverQuest, which is great for a subscription if you're the company collecting the money. You are going along with some kind of basic underlying storyline. Maybe you're part of the good guys or the bad guys, but it just kind of goes on forever, and you're warring against other factions. You do a lot of group-based activity. Some people prefer to be by themselves, but a lot of people prefer to do stuff in groups. Sorry, Jimmy, next slide. I have to remember the medium. Here, I'm reading off my own screen. While you're banding together with these other characters, you're going on quests. Usually you're killing monsters. They're pretty simple mechanics. You know, killed 9 rats, bring me back the sword of whatever, and you get some bonus. You often have a lot of people making things. There's a craft work component, and people socializing. Next slide. So why I study these things? What the heck will the results of any research tell us? And there are 2 main reasons, which are a little bit independent of one another. And you got to be careful about which of these 2 reasons you're fulfilling, I think. The first is that these things are worth studying in their own right just because they're interesting. And there are a whole lot of people using them. Whenever millions of people adopt some new phenomenon, that's usually enough for communication researchers to just want to know what's going on in general. Whether there's some bigger, deeper meaning isn't always important. And there are about 45 million people supposedly, theoretically, using these systems in the West. If we were to add in the Asian numbers, that number might go up by a factor of 3, maybe. The problem is nobody knows for sure because companies all lie because they all want to sound like they have more users than they do. It makes them sound good. But, you know, you can be conservative, cut those numbers in half, and you're still talking about a lot of people. So these things are no longer niche, they're pretty mainstream activities. And they don't have particularly well-known impacts. We don't know who makes money off them. We don't know what the psychological effects are. We don't know what the social ramifications of them are. So they're worth studying just for that. The second reason why they might be worth taking a look at is something I call the mapping principle, which is if these things are mirrors of real-world activity, they could be really interesting in a totally different way. Do the behaviors in them match those offline as far as how social networks work? Does economic behavior in this space, does it mirror economic behavior offline? Does the way that a group interacts in the game world mirror the way that a group might interact in the offline world? Does conversation work the same way? Does conflict work the same way? Do people learn the same way? If you do these things, it could make them really interesting test beds for studying behaviors in the offline world, or vice versa. Next slide, please. Of course, that's sort of easier said than done. I don't know how well you can read I don't know how big the type is for you guys there. You wouldn't want to just say that, well, I found a behavior in World of Warcraft, and therefore I now know that that's how things work in the real world, because there are a lot of conditions that don't map from one to the other. The most obvious one is that when you die in the virtual world, you get to come right back to life, and in the real world, obviously, you don't. And that in itself is going to impact the kind of behaviors you might have. Most specifically, it's going to impact the kinds of risks you might take. If you're in a virtual world, you're like, oh, there's a cliff. I'll jump off of it and see what happens. Maybe I'll die, maybe I won't. And obviously, in the real world, you're not going to do that. This kind of came out most famously when there was an incident called the Warcraft Plague, where there was a game code glitch, where there was a disease that was spreading around a virtual world, and it was bouncing from player to player. And a lot of epidemiologists thought, wow, this could be a really interesting way to study disease vectors and how diseases spread. And maybe that is a behavior that maps, you know, risk aversion. And the problem is, in the game world, people were gleefully running around and killing each other. Like, one guy would run up to the next, give him the plague, watch him die, and cackle madly. And that's not something that would happen in the real world because, again, the risks don't match up from A to B. So there's a place where you wouldn't want to say that behavior in one would map on a behavior in another. But in a lot of other pieces of research, we found that they do. A lot of things about interpersonal behavior do seem to map. People's eye gaze, the distance that they have away from each other. There's a really interesting study that came out about a year and a half ago where if people wore the color black on their avatar, they behaved more aggressively because they thought that was kind of almost like a badass mentality, like, well, I'm wearing black, I'm a little more assertive. People are more deferential to taller avatars than smaller ones. So you do have some hints that there are a lot of interpersonal components and variables which do map from virtual to real. This grid that I put up here is a list of all the things you'd have to pin down before you said anything definitive about something mapping from one to the other. If you're really specific about what your research is. So, am I studying something, the group size, what's my unit of analysis? Am I talking about communities, am I talking about dyads? And you wouldn't want to take research from one and apply it to another. You'll be really specific. This is the little one I'm working on. What are the controls that I have? What are the contexts of the world? Do they vary from one to the other? Are people role-playing or are they not? Are they on the same team or are they not? You want to be really specific about all these things before making any kind of mapping claim. So I'm happy to talk about this at length. I got a whole paper about this that I've been thinking about. It's a pretty big issue in the research space, I think. If you care about that second reason for doing the research. If you're just interested in the stuff because it's big and there's a lot of people doing it, and that's good enough on its own. This is a little more ambitious. Next slide. So previous work, as I mentioned, has a lot of experimental stuff. There hadn't been a ton of work in virtual spaces. Really only a handful of us who've been working on it. It's gotten a lot more popular lately. I did some early experiments, and there are a couple other people doing experimental designs, but not a lot yet. There have been a lot of surveys, but they all had self-reported data. So most well-known are Nick Yee's data. If anybody's worked in the space, they've probably seen Nick's work. And so he had people come to his website and fill out surveys. The problem is you wonder, who came and filled out the surveys? Are they representative as a sample? And you can't really be sure. They're pretty good, probably, but we don't really know. And then the ethnographic approaches, which have become really popular recently, where you go in and take a more anthropological view where you're interviewing people and learning about what they're doing. That stuff is great for getting at the detail of meaning and social context. It tends to be weaker when you're trying to make a broad case about generalizability. In that same sense I was saying before, like, I went and talked to these 10 people and I really know what's going on with them. Can I now say something about the whole player base or society? That's a tougher leap to make. So you've got breadth and depth issues with these different ones. So for us, we wanted to combine all these approaches, but also get that back-end survey data that's collected. And so what we're able to do is, in conjunction with Sony Online Entertainment, they gave us all the data that the game generates, and they also let us do a survey with them. So we've got these two primary data sets to work with. One is a record of everything that everybody's ever done in these games, and it's collected by the second, and the game's been going for about 4 years now. So every action, every interaction, every transaction. We don't have real-world identities for these people, and we don't have the content of the communications between them, but we have everything else. Those are privacy concerns, so we don't want to touch those things. But then we also have surveys of a big chunk of them, so we know a lot about them offline. So that's a nice combination of behavior. We know the demographics, we know the psychological profile, and then we also have this unobtrusive behavioral stuff to combine it with, to match. Next slide, please. This is a big, ugly slide just to show you that we have a lot of stuff. I can get into it, but really my point is it's big and ugly and scary, and it takes a lot of money and computing power. These are all different databases that are associated with the game, and we have to try to match them, get them to work together. Some of them are about where the people are, what they did, the experience, the quest they're on, the monsters they killed, the spells they cast, blah, 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 blah. That's a lot of stuff. So just remember there was a big, ugly, scary slide. Next slide. Many of you in the audience are familiar with statistical analysis. Some of you maybe not as much. But when we do analysis on a big database of somebody, say, like from a national election study, we might get 20,000 or 30,000 people possibly, and that's a big, big file. And say you want to run a regression on it, you throw it into SPSS or Stata or SAS or something, and your machine chugs along for a while, and maybe in a fast machine it might take a few seconds, a slow machine might take a minute for some of these things. But they don't scale. The algorithms that those computer programs use don't work when all of a sudden you've got 1 million entries or 10 million entries or, God forbid, 1 billion entries. And that's the kind of volume we're looking at in this. So we actually had to have computer scientists come in and write new code just to do the things we used to take for granted before. A lot of regression, for example, as you cycle back, take this, go back and look at it this way, now go back and look, you keep going back and looking at it again. It's called a recursive method. And you can't do that when you're sifting through 50 million rows. It would take, even for a supercomputer, it would take, like 2 weeks to do it that way. So we got to write new algorithms to have somebody go through the data just once or in little chunks. So it's a whole different way of thinking about it. That's one of the main reasons we have to work with computer scientists.